what catches me is the way that the vocal is constantly echoed by George Harrison's guitar line. John will sing a melody line, and before he's even finished singing it, George will then echo it, and then goes back to John again.
So while they're experimenting with new chords and sort of new structures to songs, they're also starting to experiment with other things and psychoactive substances.
The very, very early days of the psychedelic revolution, I guess you could say. I mean, 1965, you know, they first take LSD. I think it was John and George, if I'm right, with their dentist. So John Lennon's mind was completely blown by this. And the other thing about LSD is that it plays very heavily on whatever psychological disturbances and problems that you might have had.
Some people say that Paul walked out and therefore he's not on the recording at all. Others say he had already recorded the bass part and then walked out.
This was a song where he's trying to work it all out at the same time. And then, you know, when he says, I said, no, 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 you're wrong. That to me is someone who is being faced with a situation which they're uncomfortable with.
It's June in 1966. The US has landed its first spacecraft on the moon to take photos of the moon's surface, matching the Soviet Union's previous achievement in the space race. Bob Dylan has been heckled, booed and called Judas by folk purists during his UK tour for playing with an electric band. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, starring the married Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, is showing in cinemas. It goes on to be nominated for 13 Oscars. And the first British credit card, the Barclaycard, is being rolled out. Meanwhile, the Beatles realise they are a song short for their upcoming album Revolver. They set about to complete one that John had started writing after a memorable acid trip with the actor Peter Fonda. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. With the help of an expert, we examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician unpicks the lyrics and music. I'm joined by writer and chief rock critic for the Times, Will Hodgkinson, and musician and Fab Four fanatic, David Bennett. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we break down She Said, She Said. So Will, what's your initial thoughts when you first heard She Said, She Said, and what have you gone on to sort of think about it since?
She Said, probably I first heard it as a kid. I remember Revolver, my brother getting it, which is kind of unusual because this would have been the 1980s. And the Beatles weren't particularly fashionable, but my brother developed an absolute fascination with them. The cover fascinated me. It was like, you know, as a kid, it was a little bit like a comic, but it was also something more. It had songs like Yellow Submarine, which were easy to understand, but She Said had something incredibly exciting, incredibly vibrant. At the time, I couldn't have known that it was reflecting LSD and things going on at the time, and it had this folk rock influence, all of which came later. But I think She Said was my entry into the music which I really love, which is that period, that early psychedelic music, which has got influence of folk, kind of folk rock. Bands like the Byrds, Love, the Buffalo Springfield, the Doors to an extent. And the Beatles were working alongside those bands, really, especially the Byrds. So She Said was my insight into this incredibly exciting Anglo-American underground phenomenon, which the Beatles, although they were the most popular band in the world, were tapping into, which is just so amazing that they're tapping into all this magical, very, very, you know, kind of cutting-edge stuff. Whether that's psychedelic, whether it's psychological, literary, all these things. It felt like it's all in there. And as you get older, you realise that She Said is also questioning it all, you know, at the same time as they're discovering it all, which I just think is magical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not, they were influencing these bands such as the Byrds, as you said, and then they were getting it beamed back to them, and then they were taking it to the next level from there, which I always find interesting. And Dave, what grabs you initially musically when you heard She Said, or what grabs you now that just pricks the ears and sort of goes,
I think, well, immediately what catches me is the way that the vocal is constantly echoed by George Harrison's guitar line. It sort of prevents the energy from ever dipping, because in the gaps where John isn't singing, you have another melody coming through. So John will sing a melody line, before he's even finished singing it, George will then echo it, and then goes back to John again. And then George again. So, like we see in loads of Beatles tracks, they're thinking about arrangement, they're thinking about filling the gaps in the vocal, making sure there's always a level of energy.
Mm-hmm. And they were doing this call and response, but it's also, it's not quite a sort of standard song for, you know, the basic chords of G, D, and E. It's sort of got a different sort of feel and sound to it.
So what we call it, so from a technical point of view, is the Mixolydian mode, which isn't a thing I think the Beatles would be familiar with. But in many ways, it's sort of the rock version of the major scale. So the chords we've got here are B flat, A flat, and E flat. The A flat chord there is the important one because that's the flat 7 chord. You wouldn't get that in the major key. And it gives it a more sort of open sound, which is really typical of rock music and something that becomes almost a cliche in the 1970s and 80s of classic rock. When you think of artists like AC/DC, they're always in that Mixolydian sound. But although the Beatles were no strangers to this Mixolydian sound, it was definitely giving it that slightly proto-classic rock sound. Like, I think, you know, we're only a few years away from Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple. You can almost hear that type of, those chord choices coming in now with this song.
So while they're experimenting with new chords and sort of new structures to songs, they're also starting to experiment with other things and psychoactive substances, which then is directly correlates to the writing of She Said. She Said, well, could you explain sort of what was happening in the Beatles' lives at that point?
Very much so. I mean, this is the very, very early days of the psychedelic revolution, I guess you could say. I mean, 1965, you know, they first take LSD. I think it was John and George, if I'm right, with their dentist. But this was the really interesting situation. What had happened was they're in America. They were staying at, they're renting this house, which is Zsa Zsa Gabor's house in Beverly Hills. And they were kind of kept prisoner because this was really the height of Beatlemania. And they couldn't get out. There were security guards everywhere, there were police everywhere, there were fans outside, there were girls getting in. Apparently there was a girl under the piano, all this kind of stuff. So they thought, well, what should we do? Well, they took LSD. I don't think Paul took it, but the others did. And they were with Roger McGuinn and David Crosby from the Byrds. The Byrds at the time were exploding. You know, they've been doing Dylan songs and, you know, they've been traveling around America with a Ravi Shankar cassette. So they've been getting all this Indian influence. And George Harrison had been, you know, he'd discovered the music of Ravi Shankar. So that was all going on at the same time, which we can come to later on. But LSD, I don't know if you've ever taken LSD. Can we talk about this?
Of course, yeah.
So I have taken LSD in my youth. And I'm not recommending it or not non-recommending it, but it is the most remarkable thing. It's not a drug in the normal sense at all. It's completely in the brain. It's completely psychological. It's not a pleasure thing. It's something which really does change your perception. You know, suddenly you're seeing the world and it's the same, but it's almost like a prism of the world, which is, you know, the same but totally different. And it's like the portal's been opened. So John Lennon's mind was completely blown by this. And the other thing about LSD is that it plays very heavily on whatever psychological disturbances and problems that you might have had in your life. And we've all had them. And John Lennon had more than most of us. Peter Fonda, who's the son of Henry Fonda, who then obviously went on to star in Easy Rider and become a huge countercultural figure himself, had been shot. Actually, no, he shot himself. He had a self-inflicted gunshot wound when he was 12. And they were taking LSD, and because of all the crowds outside, they had retreated into this giant bathtub, which they were all sitting inside and tripping in, basically. You know, Roger McGuinn was there, they're all there. And Peter Fonda started saying about how he knew what it was like to be dead, and he actually showed them his gunshot wound. Now, if you're on LSD, you're highly, highly suggestible. You know, this is like an ultra sensitive state. And John Lennon was freaking out. He's going, get him out of here, man. Get rid of that guy. I can't handle him. They didn't really know who he was at the time. You know, he wasn't famous then. So that was going on. You know, at the same time, this is when you had people like, you know, Aldous Huxley had written The Doors of Perception. And then there was Timothy Leary, who's The Psychedelic Experience, and it was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is actually a very sacred text about how to pass from this life into the next. But he was saying that LSD is like being dead. You know, it's all tied in with this. It's like a rebirth where you're seeing the world through a different form. Now, what I found absolutely amazing about this song is that John Lennon went away and thought about all this stuff. Not only culturally on a sort of more shallow level, you know, this was the point at which, you know, the folk rock thing was booming, Dylan was going electric, like you said, all that was going on. But, you know, on the deeper kind of, psychedelic level, he was thinking, well, what does this mean? You know, what does it mean? And the song's so beautiful because he's talking about all this stuff and he's just repeating what Peter Fonda had said, obviously changing the gender. But then you've got that amazing section when he says, when I was a boy, which I believe was from a different song. But what's so beautiful about it, I think, is that he's trying to get back to innocence. You know, and LSD is such a very strange thing because it does create this kind of childlike state, but at the same time, it can be really terrifying. And, you know, and I think John Lennon was dealing with all this on top of dealing with something which nobody had dealt with before, which was being in the most famous band ever. What does that do to your head? Imagine having all that attention and then being on LSD and then... You know what I mean?
And then Peter Fonda turning up.
Peter Fonda, hey man, did you see my gunshot wound? You know, I mean, there's a lot to cope with there. No wonder he was, you know, no wonder it was psychologically damaging.
I think he was sort of haunted by this experience because it was a few months later that he wrote the song, right? It's not like the next day.
It
stuck with him,
I mean, I can really, really see it. And I mean, you know, I only took LSD when I was about 17 or 18 and a few times, and I've never done it since, and I never would. But at the time, I remember thinking it was a hell of a lot to cope with. And if you're not careful, the emotions pour in and you can't handle it. But I remember thinking it was a sort of wonderful liberation as well. And so to have, you know, to think about what Lennon was going through. I mean, George Harrison, maybe he was a bit of a different character. And Ringo apparently was just like, got the wrong end of a pool cue. He was like whacking pool, you know, so he was fine.
That sort of plays into the sort of characters that you think of. John takes it introspectively. George as well takes it introspectively. And Ringo just is having a good time while he's on it.
And Paul, no way, out of control, you know. So, yeah, I mean, you know, I was saying to you guys earlier on, one of the things I really love about the Beatles is not just the musical influence, obviously brilliant musicians, but the four characters. It's just the chances of having those four characters who are so different. A very shy, introspective, spiritually inclined person, a happy-go-lucky guy, a very tortured, brilliant mind who naturally is suspicious of the world, and a very ambitious, ultimately positive guy who wants to really push things. Who would have thought? And I think at that period of Revolver, they were working very, very well together as a band, but already you had these characters kind of clashing, but not that much yet.
Well, even the act of Paul not taking it, that sort of separates John and George, especially because they'd taken it before. Now Ringo's joined that group. They're excluding Paul in a way, and I believe they used to make fun of him for it, for being a bit straight. You know,
I think they did. I mean, I think the Paul was funny because Paul was very hip in many ways. You know, he lived in central London with Jane Asher. He was funding the Indica Bookshop, which is this incredible countercultural place run by a very cool guy called Barry Miles and Peter Asher, Jane's brother. You know, Indica Bookshop put on Yoko Ono's first London show where she invited people to cut off her paper dress. And, you know, so Paul was very interested in art, culture, quite hip. But at the same time, I think, I'm sure he consequently did, but at that point, the idea of this strange new substance, which was so untested, but people like not Aldous Huxley so much, as people like Timothy Leary was saying is going to completely change your perception of life.
You can't go back after that in a way. Paul would be afraid of that.
Would you want to change your perception of life? Things are going well.
Exactly.
You know? Do I want to throw everything out?
And it's interesting that though John was tortured by this moment and he wrote a song about it, it wasn't finished, and when they went to record Revolver, initially wasn't planned to be on the album.
Yeah. And as you referenced briefly a moment ago, the middle section, the When I Was a Boy bit, seemingly was another song fragment, another sort of unfinished song. And as the story goes, George Harrison helped John put it together. Of course, we don't see that reflected in the song's credit. It's not a Lennon and Harrison song, but yeah, it seems that they were effectively a songwriting team for this one.
Well, that's interesting that George would jump in on this one, the acid song that Paul had no experience on,
yeah.
and then in the recording, they have an argument and Paul walks out.
Yeah, so some people say that Paul walked out and therefore he's not on the recording at all. Others say he had already recorded the bass part and then walked out, so he's on the bass, but he doesn't provide backing vocals. But yeah, as will become a more common theme going forward with the Beatles, there are these fallouts, walkouts, and they progressively move apart as we move on through the decade.
And then when they went to record it, it's not an easy song to record. No wonder that Paul walked out. It could be a long and stressful day. Can you explain to us, like, what is happening musically in the song?
Yeah.
That meant it was so difficult and laboured over?
So the particularly odd thing, literally odd thing in this song is the time signature. So most of the song is in 4/4, which is our sort of bog standard 4 beats in the bar. Most songs effectively default to that. And if they don't default to that, they'll stay in a different one, like 3/4. But this song mixes between them, which is quite an unusual thing to do. It actually would become quite common for the Beatles later on. But at this point, it was a new idea. And in fact, the first Beatles song to mix time signatures was Love You Too, George Harrison's song from the same album, recorded a few months earlier. So it's quite possible that it was George Harrison's contributions here that encouraged John to include this time signature switch. So the bit that we have, which is in a different meter, the bulk of the song is in 4/4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. All very standard. It's when we get to the middle 8 that things change. So we have the she said you don't understand what I said. That's still 4/4. But then when we get to the oh no you're wrong, then it switches to 3. So you're wrong. 1, 2, 3, 1. When I was a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Switches back again. And it's sort of hidden in plain sight to a certain extent. And I think part of that is because Ringo seemingly switches a bar later than everyone else. So it kind of hides the moment, because if you're tracking the melody or what's John singing, it changes on the oh no you're wrong bit. But then Ringo doesn't change his drum part until the when I was a boy.
And that's where he goes onto the snare.
Yeah, he goes into the snare, and that really emphasizes, okay, we're now in a different meter. But this would become such a common thing in not only Beatles songs, but John songs, because something like Good Morning, dripping in time signature changes. It barely stays in 1 meter for a bar. Happiness is a Warm Gun, I Am the Walrus, Across the Universe, all have weird meters, but this is where it seemed to start.
Well, John famously said himself that he was quite sloppy with timings, which could help explain that some of these time signatures are just him sort of feeling out the music rather than someone like McCartney, as we're talking about, is meticulous and pre-planned and...
Classic songwriting, isn't it?
Yeah, more
rooted
typical.
in the Tin Pan Alley classic approach.
Yeah, 100%. And I think when we listen to the demo of She Said, we have almost the beginnings of that. She said, you don't understand what I said. And you can hear on the demo, he does have a few bars of 3 there, maybe just through kind of accident. But I think it was George Harrison who gave him the encouragement to say, no, we can have that different 3/4 feel here. And I think George had got that idea from Indian music, where Indian music, although it doesn't necessarily change time signature, their idea of time signature, this thing called tal, breaks the meter down into subsets. And you have some tals where it will be, like, for example, a group of 5 followed by a group of 3, you've got a group of 2, a group of 4, and that pattern will continue. So the idea that you can subdivide time into uneven periods seems to have been brought to the Beatles through Indian music. And of course, Love You Too, a very Indian-influenced song, that was the first time they ever did that.
And the other Indian influence that this song has is a sort of droning organ sound throughout.
Yeah, so something very typical of Indian music is that it doesn't really have a chord progression, instead it has a drone. And that's usually played on an instrument called a tambura, where it has various strings that the player keeps kind of renewing, and that means we have a constant sound. And we hear that instrument on some of the more Indian, so overtly Indian tracks. But here they kind of approximate that drone sound using one of the only Western instruments that can give a constant drone, which is an organ. And John literally just kind of holds down the note B flat, the home note, through the track to create this sort of subtle bed under the music.
And then on top of that, we've got the guitars layering up, using a sort of, as we were discussing earlier, folk rock influenced sound, but it's starting to get a little bit heavier now. The guitars are not clean cut as they were in She Loves You, Hard Day's Night. We're getting a little bit of grit and a little bit of slight fuzz, as I've been heard on Satisfaction by the Stones a year earlier.
Yeah, and you know, these effects were really cutting edge at the time. A lot of the pedals that we would use today to create these sounds were only just being invented at this time, and many weren't in mass production yet. So it was really a case of, you know, getting distortion. You had to get creative sometimes. You know, famously the Kinks sort of used razor blades to cut up a speaker. The Beatles, I know on Revolution, for example, they plugged directly into the desk to get that overdrive sound. I'm not completely sure how they got the overdrive on this particular song, but yeah, it was a new sound.
It's starting to become a more prominent feature of their music, as sort of guitar effects. And Ringo's drumming on this song. We got to sort of have a word to say about that. It's fluid and it's full of fills. He's enjoying sort of going around the kit.
Energetic. I think it's quite Keith Moon inspired. I think you can hear that sort of energy there.
Yeah, I guess I always think that Keith Moon was the lead musician of The Who in a way. You know, he doesn't keep time in any normal sense, does he? Yeah. And it's a little bit like that. I mean, Ringo, I think there's a bit of a myth about Ringo saying he wasn't a very good drummer. You know, the myth, I don't think anyone actually said it, that he wasn't, you know, it's attributed to John Lennon falsely that he wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. It's not actually true. That's pretty excellent drumming, you know, as far as I can tell. And also it's about what's suitable for the song, isn't it? I mean, it just again, I was really interested to hear you say about how the energy doesn't stop because of the overlapping of the repeat of the guitar and the vocal melody. And I think the drums do the similar thing, as far as I can work out. There's always something happening.
He's serving the song.
Yeah, and that's what I think about the song, because I always come back to the sort of intention of the song. I think with She Said, She Said, it's capturing a total feeling of uncertainty as well as excitement, as well as kind of, you know, he's sort of searching for reassurance at one moment. It's this new world is presenting itself. It's all happening at once. And it's really captured.
And the drums do that.
The drums do it. Yeah, the drums do it because
they throw you off, but they also bring you back and sort of tap you in.
And there's always something going on with the drums. It's not just a straight, you know, metronomic beat. I mean, it's fascinating.
Well, let's talk about the lyrics. Move on to then. Obviously, we've discussed how it was inspired by this acid trip with Peter Fonda. Well, in the lyrics, obviously we've got them in front of us. She said, "I know what it's like to be dead." That's probably a straight quotation from Peter Fonda. But what did the lyrics say to you about sort of John Lennon's mindset and what he'd experienced with this specific acid trip and sort of the expansion in general?
Yeah, it says to me that he was trying to work it all out as it was happening. You know, I think the story goes that he'd spent, the last song he'd written was "I'm Only Sleeping," and he'd spent about that's 2 months previously, because, you know, Maureen Cleave, who's the journalist who interviewed them, said he was the laziest man in Britain. And, you know, he could spend days in bed. And I think there's a side to John Lennon, despite his huge success, which had that, of someone who was, you know, I mean, you know, making me feel like I've never been born. I've heard, I Know What It's Like to Be Dead was definitely a direct quote, no question. She's making me feel like I've never been born. I've heard that Peter Fonda said that, but it's one of those things that might be lost in the mist of time. Nobody was recording this, you know. So it could have been a line that he came up with where he's feeling with that LSD, with acid. It's like, you know, he died, he was reborn, or did he, you know, did he die, was he born in the first place? You know, it's all these feelings. And again, I think I said before, to me, the When I Was a Boy is searching for that certainty. And you think about what John Lennon went through, you know, with Yoko Ono, she was really a mother figure to him, you know, and that was only a couple of years later.
Called her Mother Nature. Mother Superior.
Mother Superior, exactly. And of course, he wrote that song Mother about his own mother who'd abandoned him. You know, you've got someone who feels, and you know, what else does it do to you if you become famous at 21, 22? You know, really famous, not a bit. You know, what does that all do to you? And I think this was a song where he's trying to work it all out at the same time. And then, you know, when he says, I said, no, you're wrong. That to me is someone who is being faced with a situation which they're uncomfortable with and they're being challenged by. And it's too much for them. And it's like, again, it's very acidy. It's like, no, get out of my head.
I think the whole song is just this sort of acidy, trippy feel. Even the When I Was a Boy, reverting back to childhood, sort of the feeling that acid can make you have where you revert back to sort of a childhood state, or events from your childhood to sort of rise to the surface and things become clearer in your sort of adult mind.
But you know, the other thing I would say, in a weird, I know this sounds odd, but it's not druggy in the sense that came later, you know, where, you know, people started getting into heroin and really heavy drugs. And things became slow and dirgy, and or cocaine in the 70s when it was all sort of like brittle. This is something different. This is a questioning song. It's a song where he's trying to work things out in real time. It's not giving up on life or indulgent. You know what I mean? Or it's not actually a hedonistic song, I don't think. You know what I mean? Because rock and roll is associated with hedonism. It's not a hedonistic song to me. It's a song of someone trying to make sense of life.
I felt like the When I Was a Boy, Everything Was Right feels like he knows that there was a time in his life when he was happy, but he doesn't know how to get back there.
Exactly.
It's sort of trapped in the past.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. And the sort of questioning death and, you know, is this reality that I'm in? You know, obviously spirituality is coming in now with George, exploring that sort of idea of, you know, what is this reality that we're in? Can we transcend that afterlife, being reborn? That's seeping into John's lyrics, I'd say, as well.
Oh, totally. And you know, they're beginning to, we'll talk about this, you know, maybe on another episode, but they're beginning to discover not just Indian music, but spirituality. And what that means is alternative ways of thinking, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. I mean, you know, if you think it was August 1965 when that acid trip took place, that's early. That's pre the hippie era.
Yeah, pre-Summer of Love.
Pre-Summer of Love. And these are guys who are kind of coming out of that sort of London mod mentality, you know, sort of sharply dressed, successful, engaged in things, going to these clubs like the Scotch of St James, where, you know, they're part of this elite while the rest of Britain's still stuck in some kind of post-war malaise. And they I mean, you see it in the footage of Get Back, don't you? You know, the people on the street still look like they're post-war, and these guys have got long hair and big fur coats. I think it's probably the same even at this period. You know, these guys are going to America, they're meeting Hollywood royalty, they're at Zsa Zsa Gabor's house. You know, Roger McGuinn and David Crosby are based pretty much the hippest band in America at that point. Dylan is in the scene. You know, not there in person at this point, but they certainly knew him. So these are people who are dealing with a hell of a lot and very, very sophisticated. And I think the whole of Revolver reflects that, but I think this is particularly this song. It's kind of it's really trying to work out a lot.
And it was released on the Revolver album, as we said, 1 week before they did their final ever US tour, which was sort of blighted by the bigger than Jesus comments and fears of assassinations, etc. And they obviously never performed the song live. It would be seemingly impossible to do so.
Unlike some of the songs that would come soon after on Sgt. Pepper, it would physically be possible to perform it. You know, it's still the standard lineup of the band, no extra weird instruments really. But not only was it sort of, you know, sound-wise, to create that sound live in the 60s wouldn't have been that straightforward. It is also quite a technical performance, particularly from Ringo.
Especially over the screaming fans. They couldn't hear themselves at the best of times, let alone to change.
And it would have required, unlike early days where they were so used to gigging, these songs were tight and rehearsed. A lot of the songs in this era, they get them tight and rehearsed to record, and then they move on. So maybe they just didn't want to spend the time really honing it in the studio, ready to take it on the road.
And since it's come out, She Said has definitely been a blueprint, or at least pioneered certain sounds and subgenres, let's say. Well, does She Said have a sort of long-lasting impact on sort of Western rock and music?
I think it's got a huge impact. I think it's got absolutely massive. I think the first place you'd go to, well, the Byrds, obviously, but then I'd say there's one of my all-time favourite albums is called Forever Changes by Love, and which I'm sure you guys know. A folk rock masterpiece, which is, again, questioning things. I would have thought that Revolver would have been a huge influence on that. And certainly you've got people like Hendrix, of course. You know, Hendrix was discovering the Beatles, and I think it was unusual at the time. You know, so Black American musicians prior to this, you know, it'd been quite separate, and Dylan as well. But you know, the Beatles were being discovered by a lot of the soul and R&B people, and Hendrix was one of the first people to obviously marry rock and roll and soul and R&B in that remarkable way. But then if you jump forward, I think, well, I mean, obviously you've got the whole sort of 70s melodic influence, people like ELO and everything. But then by the time you get to the 80s, you get a lot of alternative bands returning to the Beatles and the Byrds and Love. Jesus and Mary Chain, unquestionably. Velvet Underground would have been the main influence, but I think you can hear a lot of that. Primal Scream, if you hear early Primal Scream, there's a beautiful song called Velocity Girl, which is basically what Roger McGuinn called his 12-string jingle jangle guitar sound. You know, so there's the indie sound. I mean, the Laws, that's based on the Beatles, isn't it?
Yeah, very.
And then what about Oasis? I mean, without putting Oasis down, I don't think they would ever really have the sophistication to come up with a song like She Said, but they've done, you know, in their own way. There's some, you know, Noel Gallagher is an amazing songwriter in his own way. And I think there's been that influence too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it continues. Well, Billie Eilish is a massive Beatles fan. I think she said that she loved Revolver. So, you know, it doesn't stop. I think people keep on discovering this album. She Said, obviously, you know, the entire album's amazing. Tomorrow Never Knows, one of the best songs ever written. But, you know, this magical period of in between, to me, it's always a bit of a sort of in-between thing. You know, it's got all the rock and roll influence, but it's got this questing thing before things have got self-indulgent. So, yeah, I think the influence continues.
And this sort of middle period that we're talking about, it's got the early rock and roll. It's not going to put off younger fans yet, but it's certainly a departure from the exciting Beatlemania songs, She Loves You, even Twist and Shout, All My Loving. Is it starting to sort of switch off a sort of pre-Revolver, Rubber Soul Beatles fans and a sort of more counterculturally inclined, maybe progressive, muso fan base? Is there sort of now becoming two separate Beatle fan bases?
I imagine so, and I think also it got to the point where it started becoming uncool to scream in front of the Beatles. You know, so you started getting to the point where no, I'm going to have a conversation with them. There was so much going on at the time. This is an incredibly vibrant period in 20th century history. You know, the influence of LSD was huge, but even just like people discovering marijuana and everything, and then you know the changing consciousness of you know, thinking what war means, you know, what kind of world do you want to live in, what, you know, whether you want to, what Vietnam was for, you know, the questions of patriotism, which probably hadn't come into it in the same way at the Second World War or even the Korean War. All of that was changing in America. So you definitely had that with coming with the Beatles. And I think, I mean, you could say more than this than I can, but I would have thought that by Revolver, there's so much going on musically, it's so sophisticated, that I think that, you know, people like Leonard Bernstein and all kinds of musicians were looking to the Beatles and really taking them seriously.
Yeah,
you know?
so they were winning over the more musical elites. You know, at that time, pop music really was seen not only as inferior to classical, but as a passing trend, a fad that would die. And then exactly like Bernstein was a great early champion of the Beatles because he recognised that they were not just everyday pop writers. They had such sophistication in their songs.
And that would go on to even become more advanced and sort of more prevalent as the decade went on, where pop becomes sort of the main culture.
Yeah. It begins to show the same ambition behind classical or sort of art music.
It must be also I mean, this was the time when, you know, 4-track to 8-track. That was it sounds like minor, but it was huge, I think. You know,
yeah, well, I think Abbey Road was still 4-track. Sometimes they would record at Trident, which was 8-track, but they still had those limitations. But yeah, the technology was beginning to catch up. Yeah.
There you have it. Make sure to subscribe to UnBeatled on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode. Thank you to Will and Dave for joining me today. Now, the only thing that's left for you to do is sit back, put on the record, relax and float downstream. We'll see you next time for Dear Prudence, a song written while studying meditation in India.